Going to the actual lecture itself, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Miguel, who I only got to know fairly recently, actually, and what a smart guy he is. He graduated from King's College London. No doubt you guys know that he topped the year, so he got the highest mark in his OSCEs and written exams, for which he was awarded a gold medal from his university. He intercalated in anatomy, and he's pursuing a surgical career, currently undertaking the academic foundation program in plastic surgery at St. George's Hospital. So fantastic credentials. I'm really excited to hear how he prepared for his exams. We're going to go through this. We'll have a Q&A at the end. The lecture will roughly be about half an hour or so, and we will have a Q&A with Miguel at the end, so you can ask him all of your questions then. In the meantime, feel free to post a few of your questions in the chat, but just know we will get to them at the end. But without further ado, Miguel, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's exciting to be here. It's my first lecture ever on Zoom. So I've just, these guys were just helping me get familiarized with the platform, and I think it's great and it's the future. So it's good to give my first lecture on Zoom. It's good to have so many of you here. I can see the number of participants, and I know this lecture is pitched at the right people because it's Sunday afternoon and you're here listening to this. So, this is the sort of drive that you need to succeed. I want to thank, before I start my lecture, these guys here at Bite Medicine. They're doing an amazing job, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the stuff they've told me that they're embarking upon in this journey, and it's some really exciting stuff. So, thank them for inviting me, and thank them for allowing me to be here. So, let me just start with a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Portugal. I moved to the UK at 17 to study medicine at King's. And the reason I wanted to include some of these marks was only to show you that my very first exam at medical school was a mid-sessional exam in January. I wasn't really taking medical school very seriously when I started. I was a 17-year-old kid. I just moved to a new city. It was all new and exciting. So I can't remember exactly, but I scored 50-something% in that exam. And the only reason I wanted to include that there is just to show you that, people sometimes ask, oh, how did you do what you do? You must be some sort of genius. Actually, it's got nothing to do with that. Medicine is a career, unlike perhaps other specialties. I think medicine is one of those fields where if you put in the work, you're going to get the rewards. It's as simple as that. And if you work hard enough, that's how you do well. Having said that, I hope that I can tell you a little bit about what you can do perhaps differently in this lecture. So that's that. I started with those average marks, and then I ended, from my third year onwards, which is when I really started taking things seriously after my BSc. I intercalated in anatomy. From then on, I consistently scored quite well in the year, and that culminates in the gold medal, which was great. And I'm now doing an AFP in plastic surgery, which is the career I want to pursue. And again, I think, we can talk a little bit about how I, worked to achieve those things, and how perhaps you can do the same if that's what you're going for. So the most important thing to say, I think, is a bit about a definition of success. There's many ways that you can succeed at medical school, and people often become too enthralled about, written exams, OSCEs, this and that. It's absolutely not the be all or end all. I think, having experienced other countries, I did an elective recently in the United States, and I was in Singapore as well. These are completely different ways of approaching a medical career. These places are places where your ranking at medical school matters, because that's going to affect where you're going to go for your residency, and that's going to affect how much you get paid and what jobs you can and cannot have. In the UK, it's very different. So I assume most of you listening here today are from the UK. And if that's the case, I think you need to be aware of the fact that there may be some discrepancies when you attend medical school, but actually when you graduate, it's a completely level playing field. Nobody cares what medical school you attended. Grades don't matter that much in some ways. They do for other things, but it's all about sort of the other things that you can do whilst at medical school that are really important. And the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is I wanted to tell you a little story about my granddad. He was a great man. He was the only doctor in my family, and he studied at Johns Hopkins. Then he was a doctor in the army and everything. And I'll never forget, I don't think he ever, he died before I got into medical school, but I remember telling him at the time I was thinking of applying to medical school. And I remember him telling me very specifically, any idiot with a textbook and looking back, I have to tell you, he was absolutely right. I think there is a very big difference between getting a medical degree and being able to practice medicine. And I think that's a distinction that is very important to make. Doing well in your exams does not make you a good doctor. It doesn't mean that you're going to be good clinically. So I think that your clinical exams are perhaps a better indication. I would say don't become too obsessed about doing well in writtens or OSCEs. Just work hard and try and become sort of a well-rounded person who's going to be good as a doctor, because ultimately that's what you're studying medicine for. So let's go on to the next slide. So, having said that, academic success does matter for various reasons. Let's start with in an NHS clinical career, as I've just said, it's perhaps not as important as in other places. However, if you want to go into an academic clinical career, and that's one of the ways that you can distinguish yourself in the UK, is by becoming a clinical academic, publishing your research, etc., etc. Of course, your research is important, but what's also important is that these are very competitive applications. So the candidates who get them, they're usually very well-rounded candidates, and the grades, they are a prerequisite. You most likely you will have to have good results throughout, a good sort of academic track record in order to compete for these posts. Having said that, again, it's not the be all or end all. You can make up for it. If you're very good at research and you're very good academic, then you actually might not need as high grades. It's just that usually when you apply for these posts, what happens is you get shortlisted first and then you attend an interview. So for the shortlisting, they can't see you, they can't see the achievements you've had. So they usually create a point-based system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the next slide, but this point-based system, you can maximize points by getting merits and distinctions at medical school. So that's what makes it important. Now, even more important is if you decide you want to do private practice, because again, awards matter a lot. If you go, and you see some of these doctors on Harley Street and you see what they advertise on their website and everything, if that is your ambition, you will see that you're competing against people who all have, track records of academic excellence, and they definitely, advertise that to their own patient cohorts. So you'll be competing with those people, and it's expected that you will have some sort of, academic track record of excellence as well. If you go and practice medicine abroad, same thing. You usually sit their entrance exams, but if you want to go for a fellowship, for example, if you want to apply for a residency program there, people often go for fellowship first, then they sit their exams, wherever that may be, and then they often go. And in order to get that very first job, it is quite important to get good marks to show that you're a driven and motivated student, and that you can achieve good things if they give you the opportunity to attend their institution. And finally, something that is increasingly at the forefront of people's minds, especially in the middle of the current pandemic. I've been working at an intensive care unit in London. I've been sort of redeployed, and I've been there for 6 months now. And you see a lot of people who grow really disheartened with medicine, and a lot of them consider alternative careers. And there's a lot of people who talk about it. There's a lot of people who've done it. And one of the things that is almost universally true is if you want to do something like investment banking or management consulting or whatever it may be, if you want to jump into those fields, medicine does have transferable skills, but you need to prove that you're academically able to achieve in those fields without having that background, if that makes sense. So the better you do in medicine, the easier it is to compete for these posts. So these are a few of the little snippets as to why it's important to work hard for your exams and to try and do well. Having said that, this here, I wanted to make sure to include this. I'm pursuing a career in surgery, so this applies a lot to me. I'm sure it'll apply to some of you, not all of you, but I think it's probably similar for other specialties. This is an excerpt from the core surgical training application criteria for this year, 2020. And what happens is, what I was telling you about is you get shortlisted first, then you attend an interview, and then you either get appointed or not. This is the weighting that they give to additional achievements. So this is where your merits and distinctions at medical school come in. And if you look closely, you can see that the scoring range goes from 0 to 5. 4 is having high achievements for primary medical qualifications. So if you get honors and distinctions, you get those 4 points. However, if you get a national prize related to medicine, which is difficult to do, but you can do it, that would essentially bypass the requirements, at least for this particular application, to do really, really well at medical school. You could get those points and more by doing something separate in your own time, if that makes sense. So I think, again, I just want to emphasize how important that is to make the most of these opportunities that come your way, and don't become too obsessed about exams, because they're not everything. So talking a little bit about medical school performance, I think for me broadly, if you're thinking about exams at medical school, exams in the UK mostly take two forms: written examinations or practical examinations. At my medical school at King's, we call them OSCEs. So I think let's talk a little bit about both of them. Within written examinations, I think you can further divide them into preclinical and clinical. The reason I'm going to focus more on clinical than preclinical is because from my experience, in your preclinical years, I would go with whatever your medical school gives you. So if for me to illustrate what I mean, at King's, we had a set of lectures for the first 2 years before we progressed to our clinical years. Those lectures were written by lecturers at King's, and the exam questions were set by them. Therefore, there was a lot of content, and the best way to do well, I realized this later on, was not to go and take all of these lectures that are often confusing and full of facts and end up spending 4 hours on Wikipedia trying to wrap your head around it. Is to just take it as it is, try and understand the concepts, speak to friends, speak to people in the year above, speak to your lecturers if you have to, understand the concepts. That's the most important thing. Then apply some memorization, but memorize those lectures. Focus specifically on the lectures that your university gives you, because right now we're still at a stage where preclinical years are mostly assessed in a sort of medical school specific way. Clinical years are different. The reason for that is because there's been quite a big push for standardization of medical education across the UK. So we've now got this body called the MSc, with the Medical School Council, and they set their own questions, these clinical questions, and medical schools are required to have questions meet a certain standard. And often, I know at King's it's the case now, your finals questions, most of them, if not all of them, will come from the MSc question banks, which means that I can give you advice knowing that it applies to students who might not go to King's. It applies to everyone. You all need the same way to study, the same type of knowledge. You approach questions in a different way because you're going to be examined in a similar way. As far as I'm aware, most medical schools in the UK for their clinical examinations still use SBAs, and they're clinical SBAs, and they're pretty much standardized throughout. So on that note, a little bit about how I studied and how I advise everyone to study. I think people talk about studying smart rather than studying hard. I think you have to do a little bit of both if you're aiming to do really well. But these two concepts that I'm about to introduce, they weren't something that I was familiarized with. I only started learning a bit more about this when I started getting involved in medical education, but it's something that subconsciously I did. So spaced repetition, active recall. Let's start with active recall, actually. I bet all of you, if you're in clinical years, are doing some sort of active recall, because if you're doing questions, you're doing active recall. So it's very different when you memorize something and then you just have to remember it in a sort of bland, passive way, time and time again, without actually having to activate your mind in order to understand what it, the fact. If you get asked a question, you have to think about it. So you're not only activating your memory, but you're activating your memory in such a way that it ingrains that memory better in your brain and you can retain it for longer. The other concept is spaced repetition. So with spaced repetition, the idea is, as you can see from this graph, you do a study session, you memorize X amount of facts. Over time, you slowly start to lose some of that knowledge. And the idea is that you can't study everything all the time, obviously. So if you space it out in intervals and you do one topic this week, and then in a month down the line, you repeat that topic. And then a month after that, you repeat it again. The idea is that each time you're going to lose less and less knowledge. And each time it's going to take a longer amount of time for you to lose that knowledge. And I can't emphasize how important this is, because I found, and I think most of you will agree, that during your preclinical years, it is possible to cram. You can get to a month before your exams, a few weeks before your exams, having done not much throughout the year, and you can say, look, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to study for 12 hours a day. With the stress of exams, I can do this, I can make this happen. And you can do well. In clinical years, it's completely different. There is just too much information to be able to cram. So what you have to do is you have to take a long-term approach. You have to start early, and you have to use these things, spaced repetition and active recall, in order to try and maximize the amount of information that you've got in your brain. And then when you actually go through things for the last time right before your exams, you're not taking in a huge tsunami of information. You're taking in a little bit of what you already know and just adding to that. So this is what I advise everyone to do. You don't need to have timers. You don't need to have very detailed timetables. The way I did it and the way I advise you to do is very simple. I would make a list of everything I've got to do, every single topic that's coming up in my exams. How many topics are those? I'd make a little list. I would say, how long is it going to take me? Because you need to pick a source. So let's say I'm going to choose this textbook to study surgery. Okay, how long is it going to take me to study surgery from this textbook? A week? Fine. I'm going to factor that into my timetable. You go through and you see how long it's going to take to cycle through everything once. And then you can aim to cycle through everything 2 or 3 times before your exams. I found that twice is good if you want to do well. If you want to do exceptionally well, 3 times is what you should be aiming for. And if you think about it, cycling through things 3 times in a year is very difficult. So you need to start quite early in advance. So these, again, are the 3 concepts that I encourage you to adhere to. Number 1 is understanding. I have never been able to memorize something long-term if I don't understand the concept. So when I was going through things throughout the year, my goal wasn't to memorize things straight away. It was just to understand the physiology, understand the anatomy, understand how it all ties together. If you understand the pathophysiology of a disease, you understand its mechanisms, it all ties together in your brain, and it makes it a lot easier to then take on information, additional facts, and add that to the sort of baseline knowledge that you already have. And I can tell you now, understanding never fades. At least for me, it hasn't. So I've started practicing as a doctor now. Most of the facts that I knew from medical school are long gone, but the concepts are there. If somebody asks me about a disease, I can still understand how the disease works. I might not be able to tell you the stats and figures because I've forgotten those, but I have that baseline understanding that will allow me to then add information if I choose to. So number 1 is understanding the concepts. Number 2 is memorization and repetition, just like we've said. Number 3 is practice. So that ties into what we were talking about before, active recall. I can't emphasize enough again how important it is to do questions. Do questions throughout. Even if you're not sure about a topic, even if you haven't revised a topic 100%, still do questions. Practice time and time again. Find a good question bank, and I'll go into some of the question banks that I recommend. Find a good question bank, stick to it, and work through all the questions as much as you can. Because if you do enough questions, I guarantee you, when the time for exams comes, you're going to sit down, you're going to be doing your exam, and you're going to be thinking, this is easy, because, you know, medical school finals often have what, 200-300 questions. If in preparation for these exams, you've already done 3,000 or 4,000 questions, then A, it's likely that the questions you're seeing are repeated because the concepts in medicine aren't infinite. There's a certain amount of concepts that are critical, crucial concepts that every medical student needs to understand. And people think, oh, medical schools can't possibly repeat questions. They don't need to. The concepts are repeated. So even if the question is different, the underlying concept is the same. And if you've encountered 2 or 3 questions to do with that particular concept, and you find that concept in a different format in your exams, you've done it before. It might not be the same question, but the concepts are the same, and you'll have the knowledge and you'll be able to answer it. So to recapitulate, number 1, understand the underlying concepts. Number 2, go through things again and again. Number 3, practice questions again and again. So what to use? Right. So again, another little story that I'd like to share with you. When I started my clinical years in my 3rd year at King's, right after my BSc, I used this book here on the left called Essentials of Clinical Medicine by Kumar and Clark. Most other people I knew were using the Oxford Handbook, but I just decided that this book was easier to understand things because the Oxford Handbook skipped a lot of the basic, perhaps for me, I just couldn't understand concepts from the Oxford Handbook straight away. So I decided to stick with this. Stuck with this book, I did pass medicine. And then I moved on to my 4th year. I obviously did well in my 3rd year. And I remember speaking to a final year student who told me, are you planning on using, because at King's you have progress tests. So you get assessed on the content of 3rd year. You get assessed on it again in 4th year and again in 5th year. So I ran into this final year student and he told me, are you using Kumar and Clark this year again? I said, yes. And he said, oh, you're not going to do very well because it's impossible to do well. It just doesn't have the amount of information that you need. And it's a very good thing that I didn't listen to him because that's obviously not true. I did do fine. So I think the important thing is to just stick to a source and use the same source again and again. A lot of my colleagues and friends at medical school, they started with Kumar and Clark perhaps as well in 3rd year, and then they moved on to the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine in 4th year. There is just too much information. You need to help your brain as best as you can. And the best way to help your brain, at least that's how my brain works, is to have an element of visual recall, so visual memory. Not only you understand the concepts, going through things time and time again, but if you've gone through things enough times and a question comes up, you can almost recognize where it is on the page just by having used the same source time and time again. If every time you study a topic, you do it from a different source, you're depriving your brain from developing that visual memory that you need, that is valuable for exams where these little facts matter. So this is what I would advise. It doesn't really matter what the source is, whether it's the clinical medicine book, whether it's the Oxford Handbook, whatever works for you, pick a source, stick with it, and that's all you need really. Same thing for clinical specialties. When I started having questions on, medical specialties and surgical specialties, I use the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Specialties. It's the level you need. I had friends who were using, psychiatry textbooks and this and that. I think, you need to be realistic. If I can tell you from experience, it's already difficult to memorize everything just from two of these little pocketbooks. How on earth are you going to memorize all of these topics from huge, chunky textbooks? It's just not going to happen. From my experience, 98 to 99% of questions you encounter in your finals are covered by these books and the questions that you do together. This question bank is a question bank that I recommend the most. It's past medicine. It's the most from my experience, the most accurate, the most representative. If you stick to that question bank and you use that to complement your revision from these sources, you are well on your way to success. And remember the most important thing: understand, repeat time and time again, and consolidate that with questions. And that's the most important thing you can do, in my opinion. Having said that, there's a few things that are up and coming. The guys here at Biomedicine were telling me just before I started this lecture about a new question bank they started, which is something I wish I had when I was a medical student. They're using case-based SBAs. Now, the reason I think that's great is because it clocks into that understanding concept I was talking about. If you do something as a case, you remember it. I've never been one, some of my friends say they can, I've never been one to remember patients and be able to memorize a condition from a patient I met in the hospital. I can't do that. I just get too distracted and I'm not really retaining all that information. Having said that, if I had a case at home in my own time that I was progressing through at my own rate, I think studying things in such a way really makes sense, and it helps tie it all together because you've got the understanding, you're adding the facts, and now you're testing yourself in questions that test your understanding and the facts at the same time. So I think doing SBAs in a case-based way is a much better way to learn. And I advise you guys to check out this resource that the guys here at Biomedicine have just implemented. So moving on to OSCEs. Again, I don't think there's a magic formula with OSCEs. I think it's pretty much the same thing. The same principle. What I did for my OSCEs, for every OSCE, I would write down a list of all the stations that are potentially coming up. How many, history taking stations, how many clinical skills, how many examination stations. And then I would really try and understand what it is that I can be asked for the station. So for example, in a history taking station, all right, so I can have a patient who's come in with chest pain, right? So what are the most common presenting complaints for chest pain? And you just think through it in a sort of systematic way. And you have that understanding that the station isn't asking you to diagnose an MI from a conversation with a patient. What the station is asking you to do is to have an awareness. What things do I need to rule out? What are common conditions, especially in different groups? What do I need to know when I see a patient who matches this description? What do I need to be thinking about? What red flags do I need to rule out? What are the most likely things? And if I'm not sure, what investigations do I need to do? Who do I need to consult with? What examinations do I need to carry out? So that's for histories. Same thing for examinations. You do an examination. Okay, I'm listening to the chest. What sorts of things am I listening to and why? What sort of conditions could, if I hear some crackles, what could that mean? It's having that understanding. That's the most important thing. That's the baseline knowledge. Now, the more advanced level of knowledge, comes from memorization, repetition. When you get to that, that step where all the steps are coming out super, super sleekly and everything's very slick. To me, that didn't really happen just with practice. It happened with repeating the steps again and again in my head. It's just how I work. I would understand the station. I would make it very clear in my mind what it is they could be asking me to do. Then I would go through it again and again in my head until I've memorized the steps. And only then would I go and practice, because it's useless practicing something if you don't know the steps. You're just, learning bad habits. So learn it once, understand it, memorize it a few times so that you're clear in your mind what the steps are, and then start implementing it by practicing with friends. And I can't emphasize this enough. Practicing with friends is the most important thing. A lot of people will recommend practicing with patients. I personally didn't find it very useful. I think it's quite difficult to expect a patient, to sit there for 8 minutes for a cardiovascular examination and more, even if you're not confident and you're still developing your skills. So I think definitely what you can do is you can be on the lookout for signs in the hospital. And I would do that. I wasn't very lucky. I didn't find very many. I think the first time I heard a proper heart murmur was in my OSCE, but I would still try. So if people, you can often ask doctors, if you're on the wards and you find that yourselves, not doing anything particularly productive, which is often the case. At least I experienced that as a medical student. Walk up to one of your doctors, one of your colleagues, and say, look, I'm looking for a patient with interesting signs. Do you have anyone? And you'll find they often do. The hospitals are huge in the UK, in London especially. Hospitals are very big places with a huge variety of conditions, and all signs are interesting signs. So as long as the patient's happy for you to examine them, I think that's a very valuable learning experience. But again, just to sort of summarize, the same approach I took for OSCEs was the approach I took for written examinations. First understand, then memorize time and time again. There is just no shortcut for memorizing things time and time again. It is what it takes if you want to do exceptionally well. And then practice time and time again, and you're going to consolidate that knowledge in your mind. So recommendations, I think you'll notice the 2 books on the left are mine, or I helped write them. The one on the far left is on OSCE history taking. Now, the reason I really recommend this book, even though I'm slightly biased because I wrote it, is at medical school I found that nothing really helped you take a history properly. So you would have, sessions run by the medical school where you'd go in and you'd have a patient scenario where you've got an actor there presenting to have chest pain, and you go through maybe 1 presenting complaint, maybe 2. I think the best way to approach histories is to have a very fixed framework. So in this book, what I've tried to do is I've created a pretty much fixed framework that you can apply to almost any presenting complaint. So once you've memorized those questions that you ask, that you rotate the questions in and out. So there's certain things that you always do. You always establish a timeline. If it's pain, you do Socrates. It's that sort of thing. I've tried to create these sorts of memory shortcuts to allow you to memorize history taking, because people say, if you know medicine well enough, you can take a good history. I never found that to be the case. When I started doing really well at history taking was when I actually practiced for history taking specifically. And it's very different having knowledge for written exams or knowledge of medicine and then applying that to a patient who's come in with a single presenting complaint. I never had the brain power to run through all of the different, types of conditions that this patient could be presenting with in my head whilst asking relevant questions. So I think that the only way to do it really well is to come up with a structure like I've tried to in this book. What I've also included in this book is a list of differential diagnoses when a patient comes in with a particular presenting complaint. I've listed the most common differential diagnoses you can expect, and also what are the next steps. So for each differential diagnosis that you're suspecting, I've listed what examinations you should do, what investigations you should order, what steps, management steps you should take, who you should refer to, etc. So I recommend that book. It's, I hope it's useful. The book in the middle is about the academic foundation program. Again, it's not really super relevant for doing well at medical school, but if you're here listening to this talk, I assume that you're driven. And if you're driven and you're inclined to go pursue an academic career, there's a lot of benefits to it. An AFP is a program, 2 years. It's just like a standard foundation program, except for one of the rotations, you get paid to do research. And the way I see it is you get paid to work on your own CV, because everybody's got to produce these publications and presentations, whether they want to or not. It's often a requirement to get into competitive specialties. So you're going to have to do it anyways. And the difference is you either do it in your own time or you have a 4-month block or some days set aside to do it. So I really don't see very many drawbacks for the AFP. And I think that if you're driven and you plan ahead, you should set yourself pretty comfortably to try and get one of them. And I've written this with one of my colleagues and friends, Fessel, who's a great guy, and I think this book, I hope, is useful. The good thing as well is that all of my profits from both these books go to charity, so they're not coming to me. The last book on the right is a book about examinations. I think this is probably one of the best books I ever discovered at medical school. I've never met this chap, Alistair, but he's found a way to write a very concise book that covers pretty much all examinations you're ever going to be asked to do at medical school. And he's done the same thing that I've tried to do for the histories. He's included sort of, if you see this sign, this is what it probably means. if you think this is what it means, this is what you should do, this is what else you should examine, I think it's a fantastic book. It's very well structured. It's very sort of succinct and to the point. It's very easy to just carry around when you're practicing for OSCEs. So, whether you're cramming or whether you're playing the long game for OSCE prep, buy this book. I think it's a really, really useful book. So I want to move on to something slightly different. I know that most of you are here to hear about, how I did well in my final year. I hope by now you'll probably have understood that there isn't really a recipe for success. I think progress tests helped at my medical school. By the time I sat my finals and by the time I sat these exams where I was doing really well, it started in my third year where I started, doing a lot better than I had before. I think it was just, I started taking things a bit more seriously, and I made quite a few sacrifices in order to achieve this. So I would still go out, I would still have fun, but less. And it's very much up to you whether you want to make that sacrifice. I certainly, when I finished medical school, it's a big relief because now I have a lot more free time to do things that I enjoy doing. But at the time, I felt like it was the right step for me. I was quite competitive, and I really wanted to try and get some good marks. And once you start getting good marks, it's quite hard to then drop back and say, oh, I'm going to do a bit less. But I really want to emphasize that it's not everything. By the time I sat my finals, I'd probably gone through the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine, the relevant chapters, and the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Specialty, again, the relevant chapters, probably 6 times over the last 2 to 3 years. And the advantage that I had over perhaps other people, the reason why perhaps they didn't do as well as I was, isn't because I'm more intelligent or anything. It's just because I went through things more times from the same source. So they were using separate sources each time. They were making it difficult for their brain to memorize things. And I was going back to the same chapter time and time again. So by the end, it makes it very easy to retain all that information, or at least more of the information. And the same thing with the question bank. I worked through the whole of past medicine. By the time I sat my finals, my actual finals, over the last 3 years, I'd probably done, at least some topics of past medicine 2 or 3 times, the whole question bank almost. So that's the sort of thing that you need to do if you want to do really, really well as well. Having said that, let's talk about something slightly differently, because I really want to emphasize this to you, because I think a lot of people don't realize this, and I certainly didn't realize this until quite late on in medical school. There is so much more that you can do other than exams to set yourself up for success in the future, whether that's in medicine, whether that's in academic clinical career, whether that's in any other thing you choose to do, whether you want to go become a banker or a management consultant, anything. There's transferable skills, and there's a set of things that you can do to really stand out. I think one is additional degrees, whether you do a BSc, whether you do a GDL, which is a law degree, you can do a master's. I wouldn't 100% recommend doing a master's as your intercalated degree for a simple reason. Some specialties, when you get to specialty training, they give you marks for each additional degree that you've done. And they mark those separately. So you can't do 2 masters and get twice the number of points. If you do 2 masters, it still counts as 1. But if you do a BSc and a master's, it counts as 2. And the reason I say do a BSc and not a master's is because in an intercalated BSc, when you're doing it in the middle of your medical degree, it's the only chance you're going to get to do a 3-year degree in 1, because they consolidate the degree when they intercalate it. Whilst a master's is always pretty much a 1-year degree if you do it full time. So you can always do a BSc during medical school. And if you realize later on that you need a master's for your specialty applications, do a master's as well. And you've lost 2 years, but it gives you the points. Other postgraduate degrees, anything really that interests you, I think it's all valuable, whether it's something that you want to do relating to, healthcare, research skills, medical education, entrepreneurship, whatever it is, anything that is a postgraduate degree and you find it interesting is useful. Merits and distinctions at medical school, we've talked a little bit about that. National awards related to medicine. I'm going to talk about an opportunity that I've got coming up soon as well with regards to national awards related to medicine. But again, I think keep an eye out for these prizes, because if you win one, then you've essentially maxed out points and you don't really need to be working that hard for these distinctions, because the points are in the bag. Quality improvement, clinical audit, they're slightly different. They're both very important. Quality improvement, if you do set out to do a quality improvement project, either find a supervisor who's done it before, or really read before you start, because there is a very set way to do it. It's called a PDSA cycle, Plan, Do, Study, Acts. I know King's does them as part of the undergraduate curriculum, and that's very valuable. It's great, because especially if you manage to present it afterwards, it will give you about 11 points in later applications, which is a lot. And it's a very, very good thing to do to get that skill. Teaching experience, teaching is great. I started teaching a few years ago, and I really love teaching. I think it's, I don't know, I think it's just really useful to share how you did certain things, what advice you have, and then have people do well and come back to you and say, oh, thanks for that little talk, you know, for that piece of advice. I find it very rewarding. So, and teaching is great. And teaching is very valued in medicine precisely because of, you know, the fact that you're helping other people. So you're helping the whole medical community and ultimately helping patients. So that's why teaching is important and it's very valuable. Teaching qualifications, I haven't done any because at my hospital at the moment, you can only do a postgraduate certificate in medical education F2. So I can only do it next year, and you don't get points for any other PG certs. You only get points for one in medical education. So again, it's very much up to you. You learn about sort of teaching theory. Presentations, publications, you can't really run away from those. I would start early, find a good supervisor. If you can't, get advice from older years. How did they do it? How did they get their first few publications? Because towards the end of medical school, everybody starts getting publications. They all start magically popping up. So people know how to do it. So ask advice from people in the years above, and I'm sure they'll guide you in the right direction. And start early, because if you do, you're really, really helping yourself further down the line. Leadership and management, again, that's one of those things that, you know, having positions of responsibility, whether that's in a committee, whether it's managing some sort of, you know, business that you've got on the side, whatever it is, it makes you stand out. It's good. It shows that you can sort of multitask and balance different components. It shows that you've got these transferable skills. So again, if you can get involved in anything that related to that, please do. Commitment to specialty. This is something you're going to have to prove later on. So I know a lot of people still don't know what they want to do, but the advice that I would give is start trying to think about what, regardless of the stage you're at, the earlier the better. Start trying to think about what sort of thing you want to do, and then do things that can be applicable to it all, if that makes sense. So for example, if you know you want to do surgery, but you're not sure which type of surgery, just do projects in surgery. You're already showing commitment to surgery in general. Same thing with medicine. If you know you want to be a medic, start doing some medical projects, whether it's in respiratory or cardiology or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's medical. Same thing with GP. If you're torn between GP or surgery, maybe try and find out about surgical outcomes in primary care. Do something that's transferable. Don't let your uncertainty about what specialty you want to pursue delay doing these things, because later on you're going to find that you've just lost the time. And there's things that are very easy to do, and the earlier you start, the better. And then other achievements. People often come to me with the weirdest things they've done during medical school and the achievements they've had. Look, I think it's great. I think once you start attending interviews and you realize that you're not sitting across the desk from a robot, the people who are interviewing you, they're humans, right? And if they've been interviewing 30 people that day, if you come up with something that's completely out of the ordinary, no matter what that may be, it's going to stick out in their minds. So it's going to make you the most memorable applicant. So I'm a really big fan of doing things outside of medicine and having other interests. And I think don't become some sort of, you know, don't become obsessed with medicine. Don't do anything else. Please try and conserve your other interests, because it's really important and it's definitely what makes you stand out. So again, this is another note on collecting evidence. Working hard for your exams is great. Doing really well in your exams is great. Doing all these other things we've just talked about is great, but it's all useless essentially if you can't prove it. So get evidence for pretty much everything you do. I've got here a compilation of evidence for certain achievements that I've had. And I bet that the thing that's jumped out the most is that fairy tale hairdresser in the Snow White book in the corner. Now that was given to me by a 9-year-old girl in A&E a few weeks before my final exams. I treated her, and you know, she obviously felt the care was good, her and her family. So I got a call back to A&E a few days later, and they dropped off that book for me, the family. And I think it's probably one of the most memorable things that happened to me at medical school, you know, more so than exam results or whatever. This is it. And if I get the opportunity to talk about it in an interview, I can tell you I will. This is the sort of stuff that interviewers care about. I don't think interviewers are too interested about how you ranked in the year, whether you ranked 3rd or 5th. It doesn't really matter ultimately. But these things that show that you're humane and caring and devoted to, you know, what your career and what you're doing, and you want to make a difference, these are the things that make you stand out. Anything that is interesting, anything you feel like is an achievement, please collect evidence and present it. And if you get the opportunity to talk about it, do, because it's all valuable. Some of the other things on here are the e-logbook. This is more for the surgical applicants than anybody else. But if you're, as a medical student, going to watch surgeries and whatnot, this is the intercollegiate e-logbook. If you go on Google and you type surgical e-logbook, it's going to come up. It's approved by all the Royal Colleges, and it's great. Honestly, you log all the surgeries you've attended. You need a certain amount of details for the patients. It's all anonymized and encrypted. And this shows great commitment to specialty, especially if that specialty is surgery. I think there might be other things for medicine with regards to logging different procedures. If there aren't, don't underestimate the informal feedback type of thing. You can always, if you've done, a lumbar puncture as a medical student or some sort of procedure that's really cool and you want to get a record of it, ask your supervisor, ask one of the doctors, whoever it is, can I have your email? Write up a little letter saying your name and that you did this procedure on this date, supervised, send it to them. They'll sign it and you can add it to your portfolio. And over time, you start building up a portfolio of things that you've achieved, even if you think it's something useless. These things all matter and they all contribute to you standing out when you start applying for specialty and higher training. So this is a foundation that I started recently with some colleagues of mine and friends. We're all doctors now, and I think the reason we started this foundation was in my final year at medical school. We had the SJT coming up. Many of you may not know what that is. It's called the situational judgment test, and it's a test that you have to sit at the end of medical school before you go into foundation training. If you do the academic foundation program, it doesn't really matter that much. So again, that's another reason you might want to do the AFP, just in case the SJT doesn't go well, because it's very, very heavily weighted. But it's something that's just there, and you can't really study for it or anything. I don't think you can prep, but a lot of people are terrified of it. And I remember, it was about 2 weeks to my SJT, and I was speaking to a friend of mine, and he said to me, man, I'm really scared about the SJT. And I said, man, why are you that scared? It's not the sort of exam that you can prepare for. Just read around, familiarize yourself with the examination formats and do your best. That's all you can do. And he said to me, because everybody's attended these courses and I haven't. And I said, well, if you're that worried, why don't you just attend one of these courses? And he says, because I can't afford it. And I thought that was just absolutely ridiculous that, somebody's being disadvantaged because they can't pay for one of these courses. These courses are really expensive. They cost about £100. So if you're someone who's struggling financially, you're not going to be spending money on all these courses, which means you're disadvantaged compared to everybody else. So with that in mind, I got together with some friends and we set up to register this charity. The reason we needed it to be registered as an actual charity is so that we can get corporate funds, so that we can run everything for free. We can rent the venues, we can get the catering, etc. And then all the medical students can come. The idea is that in the long run, everybody who's giving the lectures is someone who's done very well for that particular examination. Otherwise, they wouldn't be lecturing you. And we're going to do all of these events that these other companies do, and they charge you fortunes for them. We're going to do them all for free. And hopefully it's going to be really high quality. So sign up to that link. The other thing that we're doing this year is we've got some corporate funds already. So we're starting a national prize. As you saw on the way, all the way back in those slides that I showed you a few minutes ago, if you win one of these national prizes, you've maxed out the number of points for core surgical training. So we're creating an accredited prize. It's going to be an essay, probably 1,000 to 2,000 words. You're the first people to hear about it. We still don't exactly know what the topic is. We need to sit down. It's quite a formal thing. We need to sit down, come up with a board and a way to assess it impartially and to anonymize entries. It's going to be 1,000 to 2,000 words. It's probably going to be something to do with the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare landscape, either in the UK or globally. So it's going to be something topical. It's going to be somewhat short. And if you win, there's going to be a cash prize, but perhaps more importantly, in my opinion, there's going to be a prize that maxes out all of your points to applications up until specialty training, pretty much. So follow that link, sign up to that. It's just an expression of interest for the time being. But if you copy that, it's just tinyurl.com/the MedEd Foundation. Again, we're a registered charity, so there's accountability. You don't have to worry about leaving your details. And we'll be in touch when everything's up and running, the website and whatnot. So I think we've now got to the Q&A session.
You're right, Miguel. That was fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it was so useful to hear all of that, especially the great things that you're doing with the charity. What I'll say is we're going to have a Q&A now. So Miguel's just going to set that up. Just give us a few minutes. It's 4:45, so we'll run the Q&A for about 15-20 minutes or so. Ask all your questions.
How can you find out about national prizes? So if you know what specialty you're going to go into, you can often go online, and the Royal College for that specialty will often list national prizes. If not, if you're just looking for sort of a generic prize, just remember it needs to be a prize that's open to all trainees. So that's people all the way from foundation to ST8 level, which is almost consultant level. I doubt you'll have many of those people applying, but still. Google,
So,
you literally...
sorry, just for the slides, apparently you need permission to join. Have you turned on accepting? Have you turned on accepting answers?
Yeah. Oh, it says accepting questions from Byte Medicine. How do I change this? Guys, bear with us. Sorry, troubleshooting this.
So I can ask a question.
You can ask questions. Yeah. Don't know how I change this, to be honest. Can you set up the Q&A from your end, perhaps? No.
For now, let's just, if it's not working for you guys, we can do it through the chat. Yeah. Sorry about this, guys. So if you ask your questions in the chat, but just try not to ask too many at once. Just if you sort of stagger them, we'll definitely get to all of them. So I'll have a look at the chat and I'll fire you some questions, Miguel. Is that all right?
Yeah. I'm looking at the chat now. I can start. I'll start.
Okay.
I think I'll start from here, and then anyone who I've missed, please just send your questions again, and I'll try and address them. So, what is the best book with concise notes that makes active recall easy? So if you've got that understanding that I've talked about, I think the Oxford Handbook is great. For clinical medicine or clinical specialties, I think that's where I'd start. So for example, for surgery, I didn't even touch anything else. I literally just used the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine, the surgical chapter. That's all I did. And then I just did questions. If you do enough questions, anything that textbook perhaps doesn't mention, you're probably going to pick up from the questions if it's something important. So honestly, that's the best advice I can give you. I think that little Kumar and Clark that I talked about in the beginning is great. It's a very small book and it explains things a little bit more. So if you're just starting out with clinical medicine, maybe stick with that. And if you stick with that throughout, I did fine. So I'm sure you will too. Would you be able to talk about studying for postgrad exams and success after graduation? Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps as a separate talk, I'm sure we can try and arrange that, for the future. Does getting second place in an oral presentation at our conference count as a prize? I don't think so. I think you do have to get first place in order, at least for the core surgical training applications. Again, it's great. If you did that, that's fantastic, and 100% include that on your CV. And when you're in an interview, you can of course bring it up. You can say, I did this piece of research that I'm really proud of, and it culminated in winning a second prize at a national conference. And now I'm extra motivated to produce high quality research, contribute to patient, contributing to helping patient outcomes, and also maybe perhaps even try and get another prize. So it's fantastic, including your CV, but I think unfortunately in terms of points, it might not count. Where else can you do an AFP for plastics? So I think it varies every year. If you go on Oriel, I know there's one in Scotland, there's one in Wales, which I applied to. I got the one in Wales and I got the one in London. And in the end, I sort of made the decision that I didn't want to sort of uproot. I only moved to the UK 6 or 7 years ago. So I only know London. I don't know where anywhere else in the UK. So I was a bit reluctant to move to Swansea, but I know Swansea has a fantastic plastics program. And if you're willing to move, it's perhaps one of the best plastic centers in the country. It's called the Morrison Hospital. It's led by Professor Ian Whitaker, and the research they do is sort of world leading. So it's a really good center. How many hours a day did you work on average? Oof, many. I think towards finals, I don't know. I'd probably work, I'd probably start working at around 8, stop for lunch, stop for, rest in the middle of the afternoon, and then I'd work pretty much straight up until the evening. I wouldn't obsess too much about that though, because I just did whatever I thought was necessary for me to go through what I wanted to go through. So I think you could make your aim to say, look, these are the number of topics I want to get through. This is how long I've got. I've got 3 months to go through X amount of topics. These topics take me a week on average to get through. So how long do I need? And then that means that you can track your progress. So you don't need to work 12 hours for the sake of working 12 hours. If you get to a particular day and you've done what you needed to be on track with your schedule, fine, take the rest of the day off. If you don't, then maybe you need to work an hour or two more. But I think that's more the approach that I would take. It's not sort of a fixed number of hours. It's just meeting these targets that you're setting for yourself. Can you provide examples of national prizes? Yeah, so these national prizes are usually quite specific. It's usually, for example, an essay competition or a suturing skills competition or something. It's very prescriptive, and they'll come out with a title and it will say it's open to all trainees. If it's not open to all trainees, it's still valuable, but it might not give you the points, at least for core surgical training. I think it's difficult to tell you about any specific ones at the moment. I've told you about our essay one that we're coming up with soon. I'm not sure what other ones are there. What is the best book with concise notes that makes active recall easy? I think we've sort of talked about that a little bit. Can I talk about my experience applying and doing a sub-internship at Harvard? Yeah, wasn't the best. I didn't love it. I think it was interesting, eye-opening. I wanted to find out what it was like to work in America. But having been to Harvard, was the work ethic was something that I wasn't used to, and I worked very hard. So I think that should say something. I met people who lived for their career, and this is not an exaggeration. I'm literally talking about people who lived for their career. One of the residents who was there while I was there, he had a 1-year-old, and he said he hadn't seen his 1-year-old in 3 weeks because he'd moved to a different apartment to be closer to work so that he could work on his publications after work. While I was there, I worked 6 days. I was in at 5:30 in the morning, and I would leave at 8 or 9 p.m. And one of the Harvard medical students came to me and said, friendly guy, we chatted for a little while, and he looks at me and he goes, do you want to come and do your residency in the UK, in the US? And I said, no, not kidding. Like, that's a good thing, because otherwise I would tell you that you need to stop coming in 6 days a week. You really need to start coming in 7 days a week, because that's how you're going to impress. So that's the sort of mentality that they have there. And I don't think it's something that I want for my life. I was willing to sacrifice a lot for medical school to do well and get where I wanted to get. But I have many other interests, and I do loads of other things outside of medicine, and I'm not really willing to sort of sacrifice that. So I think that if you're willing to have a really grueling 1 month and experiencing what the US is like, especially the worst, the most competitive place in the US, I would say go to Harvard. Massachusetts General Hospital is crazy. But I would say it's, I perhaps regret not having done a more relaxing elective like some of my friends did. What's the best way to do spaced repetition? Anything other than Anki? I don't actually know what Anki is. When I talk about spaced repetition, what I mean is I would just go through topics, a certain amount of times. So I'd go through everything once, then I'd go through everything again, and then another time, it's almost like a sort of subconscious spaced repetition. I'm not specifically saying, okay, I've gone through this now, I need to go through it again in 7 days' time. So I don't think I did spaced repetition properly. I think other people might do it differently, but that's what worked for me. We've answered that question. Any advice to write and structure medical essays? Yeah, I mean that's quite a difficult question. I think maybe we can do a talk on something like that. I think it very much depends on the essay. It depends on what the question is. Whether it's a research essay, whether it's an opinion piece, whether it's a commentary. I'd say the main thing for people who are looking and assessing these essays is try and make it original. Because if you can make it original, you can make it stand out, then you are going to stand out and people are going to remember you, and that means you're more likely to win. Does it matter if you do your AFP in London versus elsewhere? Would you recommend doing F2 outside of England? No, I don't think it really matters, to be honest. I think it's more of a, for me, it was a geographical preference. I wanted to stay in London because sort of the whole life I've built in the UK has been in London. I would say that people say that the experience outside of London is sometimes better. I can't complain. I've had a good time at St. George's, where I'm at the moment. It's been crazy with this whole pandemic thing. I've been working really hard and it's quite rewarding. But I do know that a lot of people say that going out for F1 and F2 is useful. Now, later stages of training, you might want to be in London or at least at a big research center, especially if you want to do research. You don't want to end up in the middle of nowhere. So that's the only advice I give. Which part of your exam prep would you start doing from which part of your exam prep would you start doing pass med questions? So I have friends who did pass med questions per topic. I never did it per topic. I would just do the whole pass med. Even if I didn't know a question, I thought, if I don't know it now, I'll probably know it next time I go through it. And I would, make a little note. So for example, if I saw a question about a topic that I wasn't studying at the moment, I had absolutely no clue, I'd either try and remember it or I'd write it down somewhere. I'd annotate that little Kumar and Clark that I have. I'd write in the margins. I'd go to the respective chapter and write it there. And then, hopefully the next time I revise, I'll go through it again. But I guess if you're starting right at the beginning, looking back to third year, then maybe I guess it would make more sense to try and go through a topic, understand the topic, and then do the questions. So that might work better at the beginning. And then towards the end, when you've seen more content, then just work through the whole question bank. Can you still get an AFP without publications? Yeah, of course, I think so. Of course you can. Again, it depends where you apply, because some places are quite difficult. So some of the more competitive AFPs, I think you might struggle to get. But I wouldn't let that discourage you. And if anybody tells you can't get them without publication, they're lying. You can definitely do it, and it's not worth a shot. So it's worth a shot. So you can distinguish yourself in other ways. I would say find out where you're applying, find out what criteria they use. For example, London are very transparent about their shortlisting criteria. Familiarize yourself with that and work towards it. And then, if you do well enough in other areas, then you can definitely get away without any publications. Anki or Quizlet. I've never used any of them, so I'm not sure. How do I publish a book as a junior doctor? I don't know. I just, I worked after work, and I thought it was quite a valuable thing, because I didn't think there was a book out there that was very good. There is one book, but I think it's an absolute rip-off. And I know the person who wrote it, and I know what their ambitions are, and they're very, I don't want to talk badly about anyone, but I knew they were making a lot of money from that book, and I didn't think it was a very useful book, and I didn't think it was fair for students who were spending money on that book. So me and Faisal really wanted to put something out there quickly that was cheaper and better, and actually, that people actually benefited from if they bought it. How did I juggle studying for exams, research projects, publications, and teaching? Look, I think there's a time and a place for everything. So for example, with teaching and societies and whatnot, I get a lot more involved with that in the beginning of the year. And then sort of towards exams, I'd slowly start to do less and less. One thing that isn't mentioned here is exercise. I would exercise throughout. Exercise is really important. It's one of the things that I can never do without, otherwise I'd go crazy. So, try and make time for everything, and just, have these cycles in your life. You go through a period where you're relaxing a bit more, and then all of a sudden you have to work. I think the most important thing is to just not work for the sake of working. If you have sort of a goal in your mind, what you want to accomplish, how much you have to get through, how long you have, then allocate time that way, and you'll see that there's time for everything. How do merits and distinctions work? I think that depends on the medical school that you're at. I know at King's, you get a merit if you're in the top 10% that year, and then you get a distinction. It's usually for the accumulation of 2 years, except in final year, which is in itself gives you a merit and a distinction if you get in the top 10%. So I think it varies depending on medical school. What's my opinion on writing notes? Look, I think the reason I did so badly right my first year was because I was making notes. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't make notes, because different people revise in different ways. And before I came to the UK to study medicine, I studied in Portugal, and I studied the International Baccalaureate, the IB. And I did quite well in the IB, and I made notes for everything. So that worked then, it didn't work now. I think the problem with writing notes for medicine is that there's so much content that it's very easy to just spend all of your time writing notes rather than memorizing your notes. So I would say my preferred approach would be to pick a source and then annotate that source rather than writing the whole thing from scratch, because I think you waste a lot of time and you're not actually memorizing anything, and you're sort of working really hard with, not achieving much. Any suggestions for orthopedics? I'm not sure if that means sort of prizes or publications or anything. I think the same approach for every specialty. Find supervisors who do T&O, ask them to do publications, presentations, try and get involved early, get involved in an orthopedic society. Look ahead to what the application criteria are for trauma and orthopedics. Familiarize yourself with it, and then just work towards it. Most least geographical location for F1. I think it depends on whether you're doing a normal foundation program or an AFP. If I'm not mistaken, Oxford is consistently the most competitive location in the country. London is pretty competitive as well. Least competitive, I don't know. I think it's difficult to say. It really depends on how many people apply in a particular year. So I think all those figures and statistics, I think, are probably online. So if you go online and you try and find that, I'm sure you'll be able to find it on Google. Did you just read over the pages of the handbook and make notes as well? So I didn't make any notes. I would read over the pages of the handbook, but then when I saw questions that weren't on the handbook, I would just annotate it, or I'd stick a little post-it with some extra information. So by the end, you couldn't even close my textbook because it was so heavily annotated with all of this stuff. But I didn't make any notes. Yeah. What is your feeling of doing some placement time somewhere in the States? Is this something you can do during foundation years? I'm not sure. I know if you want to go to the United States, I would really look into it in advance, because especially if you're in your preclinical years, try and do your USMLE step 1. It's very preclinical. And once you get to your clinical years, you're really not going to be doing that. So if that's your goal and you're really sure you want to do it, I would start by finding out, what specialty do I want to go to? Go on Google and find out the competition ratios for your specialties for IMGs, which are international medical graduates. Some specialties like orthopedic surgery are pretty much impossible to get as an IMG. I mean, maybe it can be done, but if you look at the statistics, the average IMG who matches into trauma and orthopedics in the US, it has about 28 publications or something, and most of them are actually consultants of their home countries, and they've then started from scratch and gone back to retrain in the US. I don't think the healthcare system in the UK is that bad that you'd want to do that. So if you're going for a really competitive specialty, I'd say it's pretty difficult, but nothing is impossible. I'm sure you can do it if you work for it. Any resource bank other than Past Medicine? I think I used Past Test for a while in my third year. I'm not going to lie, it wasn't great. I think it had a lot of random questions that I didn't really feel, helped. But if you've worked through Past Medicine, the whole of it, and you're confident that you know that content, then by all means, move on to something else, and it won't hurt. Would being awarded the Biomedical Vacation Scholarship from Wellcome Trust count towards a prize? Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty confident that if that's a competitive application that you had to, compete to get, absolutely. And even if it isn't, I would still put it on there. So when you get to your application on AFP, foundation training doesn't take this into account. They don't look at any of these prizes. Academic foundation programs do. And if you get to that section, you're going to get, X amount of prizes, 10 prizes, and that's the maximum number of prizes you can put down. If you've already got 10 prizes that are going to be approved, then cut this one out and just include the other 10. If you've got 8 or 9 prizes and you want to make up for it, then add this in. The worst that can happen is they can say no and reject it. So you don't lose anything by including it, unless you're getting rid of one of your other prizes to include this, and then this one gets excluded, if that makes sense. Rest in peace to these questions. For London FP, does academic decile become higher or lower with or without publications? So for the AFP, you get long listed first, and then you get shortlisted. For long listing in London, they don't reveal what the cutoff is, but I think it's probably around the top 60% of the year. So it's really not that bad. Top 60% of the year gets you into the shortlisting, and then your ranking starts to matter as a point-based way, if that makes sense. But I know that there is definitely an absolute cutoff for you to even start, for them to even look at your application. But I think that's you don't need to worry about that unless you're in the sort of bottom 10 to 20% of the year. How did I study for surgery? I used the surgery section of the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine and questions. How did I try and get a publication? I think having a good supervisor is the most important thing. I've never really had a great supervisor, so I tend to just try things myself. I think asking older years is the best way to start. People who've done it before. I'm happy for you to leave your emails, and let me type this. I'm going to find a way to send you my email at the end, and then you can email me any questions you have, and I'll try and answer them. And if you're struggling to get a publication, we can talk about something. How do I stay motivated if I have other things in medicine to deal with? That's a difficult question. I think like everyone else, you have your ups and downs. You have times where you're like, oh, is this really worth it? Your friends are messaging you, telling you they're going out in London, they're going clubbing, they show up outside your house and they're waving at you from the window to come down and go out with them. And I think, sometimes you give in, sometimes you don't, sometimes you're more motivated, sometimes you're less motivated. I think everybody has ups and downs. You can't be too hard on yourself. If overall you work hard, that's all you can really do, really. Nobody's going to, you shouldn't demand that of yourself because nobody else demands that of you. Has the feedback link been posted? Yes, it's in the slides. I think there'll be one of those QR codes that you can scan. After going through these questions, I'll go to the end and we can go to that. What other things I do outside of medicine? I love kickboxing. I've kickboxed since I was 5 years old. I used to compete when I was quite young, sort of 14, 15. And then, I started having less and less time. Go to the gym. I don't know. I've various different things that I like to do. And F1 pros and cons. Look, I don't think there's many pros and cons to the to the AFP, if I'm being totally honest. I think a lot of people try and come up with, say, you've got less time to acquire your clinical competencies. Having gone through it, you could probably acquire all of your clinical competencies or sign-offs for things like, cannulation, venipuncture. If you're working competently as a doctor in the NHS, in a week, you could get 2 years worth of clinical competencies done. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. The one thing that I would say though, is if you get an AFP and you have 4 months that you're being paid to do research and you do nothing with those 4 months, you get to the end and you've produced nothing, then it's going to count against you, because the next set of interviews you attend, they're going to say, oh, you're an AFP doctor. What did you do with your academic rotation? If you did nothing, then it's almost better to just stick to the normal foundation program, because then the expectation is lower. If that makes sense. What was the link for the Medical Education Foundation again? It's a tinyurl.com/meded foundation. And then you just need to leave your details on there and we'll be in touch. Any tips for PSA and SJT? I don't know if these guys at Bite Medicine do lectures for that. I know at the Medical Education Foundation, we have given some lectures, we will in the future as well. So either with us or with these guys at Bite Medicine, I'm sure you're going to be in good hands. You know, and read online. There's a lot of advice online as well. I'm happy for you to email me as well if you've got any specific questions. Did I use any question banks from past medicine? Not really, no. Resources for SJT, best way to prep for SJT. The only way to prep for SJT, in my opinion, they tell you to read all of this guidance. I think, you know, I read it just in case. It was all useless. I didn't take in any of it. What I did that I think was the most useful thing is forget every other SJT book that's out there. None of them are good. I can tell you right now, no SJT book is good, because all of them, you know, you do these books and then you look at the official exams and you realize that the answers are different and the rankings are different. It just confuses you. So my advice would be find the online papers. I think there's only 2 of them, and do them 3 times each, honestly. By the end, you can almost remember the questions yourself. That's what I did, and I did quite well in my SJT, so that's it. How many hours did I work on average to get top of the year? Again, I think it's more about, you know, how early I started working. I think I started working quite early on and I was consistent throughout. I think the fact that my medical school does progress tests helps, because I was seeing the same things again and again. So I don't think there's a sort of a fixed amount of, you know, time to aim for. How early do I need to start preparing for AFP? I think I started preparing in August, June, July. Yeah, June, July, August. I reckon if you do it properly and you're devoted, I think maybe 2 months is all you need, 2-3 months. Now that's to prepare for like interviews and everything. You obviously need all the stuff that comes beforehand. So I already had some of those publications, presentations, you know, QIPs, all that stuff that counts. You probably need to start working on that as early as possible so that you don't have to stress about it later. As a medical student with little experience, how do you get about these opportunities without much on your CV yet? I think talk to people, you know, go online, network, join the mailing list for these societies like Bite Medicine and the Medical Education Foundation. We often send out opportunities. Go on Google. Sometimes the Royal Colleges will advertise things. Societies often, if you follow societies on Facebook, they often you know, advertise these opportunities. So I think that's the best way to do it. I missed out on Wales. Yeah, that's true. I hear it's got good surf. I love surfing, so that's a shame. Can't surf in the Thames unless I want to get a fungal infection from the water. Do I have any thoughts on taking time out from foundation specialty training to travel or do something like a medical demonstrator first? Maybe, you know, plastics is really competitive. So I think it's probably going to be a reality that I'm going to have to take a year out at some point. Most people do PhDs and whatnot. I'm not really interested in doing that, but who knows? I would love to go do something like MSF for a year, but again, MSF is incredibly difficult to get into. So I don't know, probably, yeah, at some point.
Hey Miguel, sorry to stop you there. I think should we just take 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up, because you're doing a brilliant job, but I think there's probably tons and tons of questions to get through. So maybe just take 1 last question and then we'll move it.
Yeah. There's a couple asking if I use flashcards. Not really. My routine on the evening of the exam is just finish what I've got to do and just chill out. Do uni prizes count? Yes. What question bank specific KCL? I think, again, if you're doing clinical years, pass medicine for every exam. Starting this final.
Cool. Let's stop it there. Is that all right, Miguel? Yeah. You see, I don't want to tire you out because Miguel's actually a bit under the weather as well, so I don't want to push him too hard. He was very kind to join us.